Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's good to see so many people here. I'm sure some more people are going to join us on the way, but so we don't waste any time, uh, let me introduce our special guest. First of all, my name is Rabbi Noam Rauscher, and welcome to FJMC's monthly Spotlight Speaker Series. Today, we have Rabbi Dr. Thiede, who is a friend and colleague of mine from my time in Charlotte, North Carolina. I got to know her as an amazing rabbi and a great scholar and a wonderful human being who's always got wisdom to share with the community that she finds in really unique pieces of Torah, and always brings a unique perspective with her whenever she shares her wisdom with us. So I'm very glad we could have her as the first person of our Spotlight Speaker Series, the title of which is being good at being a man, what men can learn or unlearn from Tanakh. And I'd love to also read a little bit of a bio of my friend and colleague. Rabbi Dr. Barbara Thiede is a rabbi of Temple Or Olam in Concord and a professor of Judaic Studies at UNC Charlotte. Her academic work focuses primarily on the structures of hegemonic masculinity and the performance of masculinities in biblical texts. She is the author of Male Friendship, Homosociality, and Women in the Hebrew Bible, Malignant Fraternities and Rape Culture in the House of David, A Company of Men, and numerous articles on masculinity and feminist biblical scholarship. Her current project is a monograph entitled Yud-Heh Vav-Heh's Life in the Books of Samuel, How the Deity Acts the Man. She blogs at adrenalinedrosh.org, and in the spare time she wishes she had grown, wishes she had, the spare time she wishes she had, I misread that, grows her own vegetables and composts every last compostable thing she can. Rabbi Barbara Thiede, it's wonderful to have you with us. I look forward to this conversation. Please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you all. And I want to start first and foremost, before I even start sharing a PowerPoint, by indicating a premise that I think we'll all need to start with. And that is that when we confront troubling texts, we often respond by looking for a silver lining, by trying to find in a heartfelt way a kinder and more loving text. And I'm going to argue that that is an unfortunate tendency at times, because when we do not address the violence and the trauma of the text, we end up paying a price for that. Every single one of us in this room knows someone who has been the victim of some form of violence. I frequently tell my students the first day of class, you don't know who's sitting next to you. You don't know what they are carrying. You don't know what they've experienced. But statistically, I can guarantee that in any group that I am teaching, there are victims of sexual abuse. There are victims of domestic violence. There are people who have dealt with various kinds of trauma. So keeping that in mind, I would like to make the case that doing the kind of work I'm going to do with you tonight, which is to look at really violent and difficult and painful texts, is essential, because if we can't name what is there in our texts, then we are also not able to name what is around us, or to listen or acknowledge or understand the pain of those who sit with us. So that said, I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint here, and then we will be traversing some difficult territory tonight. And I want to begin by saying that in 1998, decades ago, Harold Washington, one extraordinary scholar, noted that violence, and in particular sexual violence against feminist subjects, were...
It's nerve in my neck.
Oh,
Maybe
sorry.
more than one nerve.
Friends, if you could mute yourselves, please, that would be very helpful.
Above my elbow, and then all the way down to my fingers when it's really bad.
If you recommend a massage?
Well, he gives me a little massage.
Friends, if you could silence yourselves, that would be very helpful.
I have to give it a little more time.
Let's see here.
Well, I also,
The host can mute anybody.
I'm looking to see who's speaking. Yeah.
I think we're good.
All right, Barbara, please
All
continue.
right. Massage is good for whoever is getting it.
Indeed. Indeed.
Okay. So I'll go back to Harold Washington as noting that violence, and in particular sexual violence against feminine objects, were, in his view, central to the consolidation of masculine identity in the Hebrew Bible. And over the past few years, I have moved from the study of this kind of violence to looking at the networks that enable it in this literature, but most particularly to what I would now argue, which is that sexualized violence that is male on male in the Tanakh is actually also a way in which the biblical hegemonic masculinity is of these texts and of these authors is consolidated. And we will be looking at a great deal of examples of what we scholars call feminization of male enemies, or even in some cases, your own men, being linked to dehumanization and bestialization in the text. So during this presentation, we'll be exploring what masculinity looks like in Tanakh, focusing in particularly at the end of this presentation on the story of Saul as a trauma narrative. Trigger warnings. There will be violent content and sexual violence content in particular. And I want to remind everybody that the nature of the sources, being sources which have been revered and held sacred, make the process of looking at these sources and the violence they contain charged with all sorts of potential emotional outcomes. So I do ask you all to please take care of yourself during the presentation. If that means you have to go off camera or even leave the session, I will absolutely understand. I mentioned that we often normalize violence. This is a fact of life when it comes to scholarship and the exegetes that have been writing about Tanakh for centuries. I give you just one example here in which David commits a wholesale slaughter of men, women, and children in a text. And it is, to me, infinitely astonishing how scholars have tended to normalize this behavior. This chapter, according to a famous scholar, J.P. Fokelman, shows how God's blessing is miraculously at work on David's behalf. That is a quote. There's no further comment that he makes, let alone critique of David's willingness to massacre whole populations and plunder everything in sight. And for those who are conversant with David's narrative, they know that he is regularly capable of engaging in all sorts of brutal violence, including cutting off his enemies' heads, their limbs, or impaling them for public viewing. 5 of his Saul's grandsons actually come in for exactly this kind of fate. And yet, a scholar like Walter Brueggemann writes that David is, quote, a stunning man of faith, and we, the readers, are in the presence of greatness when we read about him. So I want to note that this tendency to normalize the violence or pass over it is one that we routinely engage in. And the number of examples I could give you are so many that we could take hours to discuss. Alone, the rape of 400 women of Yabesh Gilead after every inhabitant of their town is killed by other Israelites is another such example. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about what scholars call hegemonic masculinity. Theories of hegemonic masculinity emerged largely in the 1990s, and R.W. Connell was one of the most famous scholars for developing this theory, which has now been taken up, rewritten by scholars both of anthropology, sociology, and of course, religious studies. So hegemonic masculinity establishes a standard for being good at being a man and defines and encodes and legitimizes hierarchies of gendered power. It establishes male-male relations of alliance, domination, and subordination. And these are established in terms of honor, prestige, authority, and control. It is constantly engaging in being negotiated and renegotiated. Competitions that establish honor, prestige, and authority are ongoing. I would argue that failures of masculinity in Tanakh frequently serve to actually demonstrate what the ideal is and what the ideal man will look like. And we are looking today at a particular, what Theodore Jennings calls warrior culture, that is undergirded by these hegemonic masculine ideals, particularly in the books of Samuel. Various scholars, including David J.A. Kleins, who was really pivotal in describing the ideal man of the Hebrew Bible and using David as his model, note that warrior cultures include various features of what makes a man good at being a man. So they defeat, they humiliate, they execute their enemies with ease. They are interested largely in bonding with other men. Women are the sites of male contests over power and status, but the bonding that occurs, relationship building that occurs between men, not between men and women. That warrior culture is one which is built on possessing honor and power and constantly striving for more of the same. And yet I will also say that the gender performance of these characters does not always conform to our most of our binary expectations. Jonathan is a perfect example of just such a character whose performance of gender does not always conform to our expectations or even the characteristics that I've just described here. Warriors in Tanakh have some really awful trauma to face if they are compared or in some way handled so that they become women. I've put up here a set of various verses that describe warriors who are not behaving like men in the context of becoming like women. Such warriors become female in this world. And I will also say that while I didn't give you a set of verses on this, frequently there's a second step to this process. The first is describing warriors who are not performing according to the conditions of ideal male behavior as women. But the other is that they become prostitutes. They become women who's, pardon the expression, are selling their bodies, right? These men are compared to harlots. And we find those kinds of texts in prophetic texts and in narrative texts alike. So a warrior who doesn't manifest the ideals of masculinity can be labeled a woman and regarded as or treated as a prostitute in these texts. It is also important for us to be thinking about the way in which men can be cursed. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to go back just 1 minute. Some of you might remember that David curses the house of Joab in this way: may the house of Joab never be without someone suffering from a discharge or an eruption, or a male who handles the spindle, or one slain by the sword. You can hear, in effect, that the feminizing of a man is understood in these texts as the worst thing that can actually happen to a man. So feminizing, sexualizing, humiliating in the context of making a man or naming a man as female is a primary way to describe what happens when a man fails at being good at being a man. And because I believe sometimes we need to look at the way our own culture reflects these very ideals, I gave you this. This picture that you see here before you was taken by Gen Z voters who had voted for Kamala Harris, and their tagline at the end was "Real Men Support Harris." The response that you are seeing from Robert J. O'Neill, who claims to be the killer of Osama bin Laden, is this: "You're not men, you're boys. If there were no social media, you would be my concubines." So you can see how these young men have been sexualized by Robert J. O'Neill, and they have effectively seen what a quintessential warrior of our time does to prove his bona fides. He sexually humiliates other men, and he turns the other men in effect into sex slaves for him by saying, "You would be my concubines." This kind of behavior is not unusual in our own time. I could spend an entire hour with you discussing how current this kind of language is in our culture wars, in our political settings, where men routinely belittle, feminize, and sexualize male opponents. So I want us to keep in mind that what we are looking at in Tanakh is not unknown to us in our own time. So I've mentioned that violence is sexualized in the Hebrew Bible, and that it takes multiple forms, and these forms include bestialization. Violence also is proof of male authority in these texts. I'd like to give you a few examples of what I'm speaking about here. Susan Niditch once wrote and commented on the fact that men defeated in battle in the ancient world are considered men who have been raped once. Men who are mutilated after death in battle have been raped effectively a second time. And in the ancient world, there are numerous pictorial representations of exactly this going on, where a naked enemy in the ancient world is depicted in such a way that his genitalia will face the viewer, and correspondingly the boaster, the male who is the victor, is pictured literally boring through his enemy's body. And frequently, I'm sorry to be so graphic, this is done in a highly sexual way, and often the violence is directed towards the rear of a masculine figure. We see something like this process of being raped twice when the Israelite deity Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh engineers the bringing of his ark to the Temple of Dagon. And in the first dark night, what happens is that Dagon, the statue of Dagon, or the god of Dagon, is forced to the ground, lying helpless on the floor of his own sanctuary as if dead. He is functioning as a male who is defeated, a male lying in a feminized position. And during the next night, after Dagon is replaced on his feet, he is not only forced onto the ground again, but his head and his hands are cut off. I should say that biblical scholars have acknowledged for quite some time that hands function as a euphemism for the male member, and that, as T.M. Lemos writes, the cutting off the head also connects both shame and emasculization. So effectively, what you have here is this idea of being raped twice that Susan Niditch describes. Another example of this, of course, of this kind of sexualized violence is David sort of upping the ante when Saul tells him he wants 100 foreskins delivered to the court. David doubles that dare, as you all know, and makes a very public display of counting out these foreskins Now, I would like to note that the text is not clear on whether his victims were either alive or dead. They only say they were struck, but it does not say, and they died. So we are not clear on exactly what has happened here. And the imagery evokes, frankly, a potential castration motif because we don't know exactly who is alive and who is dead when this mutilation occurs. Violence can sometimes also be metaphorical. David cuts off Saul's cloak while he is defecating, as you all know, and later steals his spear from him. Both acts are shaming, both have sexual overtones. So these are ways in which the text demonstrates what a warrior does to his enemies, and in fact, even normalizes. Again, an enemy defeated in battle will be raped once, but a mutilated enemy is effectively, in this ideological perspective, raped twice. Bestializing enemies is also part and parcel of this humiliation. Goliath is introduced in the books of Samuel as a monstrous man, as a creature in between. He goes by a name that etymologically is bestial. Goliath likely comes from a word for lion. He is described as sexually disgracing Israel. That's what David accuses him of doing, using the word cherpa, which is a word that's also used in the rape of Tamar and other places for sexual violence. And upon seeing David advance, Goliath jeers at his young foe and says, "Am I become a dog?" Dogs in Tanakh roam the streets and attack, they devour the dead, and they lick their blood. And dog is also an insult in these texts for a catamite or a penetrated male. You can see Deuteronomy 23:19 for that. Goliath will actually himself be penetrated and done away with just like a dog. He's decapitated with his own sword, again, a weapon that symbolically represents masculinity. He is effectively feminized, humiliated, raped. One could even argue that he's symbolically castrated. So Goliath dies, in effect, a dog's death after all. I want to say here that the sexual violence that we are looking at is quite literally dehumanizing. And again, I want to point out to you that in our own time, this kind of method for humiliating, debasing, and feminizing men in positions of subordination are known to us from what happened at Abu Ghraib. And of course, you probably all know that these are the kinds of things that happened in that prison setting. So that was a lot about difficult material. I'd like to move into the story of Saul to speak to two particular cases in which we see very specific sexualized violence that Saul must endure. And I will say at the outset that what I'm about to say may be not only surprising, but somewhat shocking. I've written quite a lot about Saul as a trauma victim. His entire narrative is one in which he is repeatedly humiliated, and by all sorts of male characters, including Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and including Samuel, including his own son Jonathan, David, and of course the Philistines. So his is a story, I read it as a story of trauma, or at least one can read it that way. And I'd like to start with acknowledging who he was and how he was introduced at the outset, which was as a man who was taller than all other Israelites. Height, by the way, is very important as a feature of masculinity. The deity is typically described as bigger and taller than every other possible manifestation of being. Good looks and beauty are also critical in the Hebrew Bible as a signifier of power. And he is introduced, almost introduced as being in a kind of a beauty pageant lineup. He's, visually set up to be standing next to all other Israelites and being heads and shoulders above them. this tall man who will later be curling himself into the corner among the baggage rather than be crowned king. If you didn't remember that, take a look at that text again. That's an interesting moment in his life. Now, one of the things that the prophet Samuel says will happen to Saul, he's going to experience a number of signs. One of them is to meet prophets who are themselves in what scholars understand to be a kind of sexualized, ecstatic state. And in that moment, the Ruach Adonai is going to grip, is often how this word is translated, and Saul himself will speak in this ecstatic way and become another man. What is important about this text? I've indicated in red what I really would like you to pay attention to, and I'm afraid I didn't get the tzadi in red. So salach is the shoresh that we are looking at here. And salach actually has a violent set of meanings that translators repeatedly and regularly avoid in certain contexts in translating Tanakh, and this is one of them. Salach means to split or to force an entry or to penetrate. Kohler and Baumgartner, which is the quintessential encyclopedia, describes all of these ways in which this term is used, and they point out that when it is used with prepositions el or al, we can assume it means a forcible entry. In fact, if we think about this, if the Ruach Adonai had forcibly entered a female character, it is possible that we might think about this text differently, that we might react to this text differently. And I'd like to acknowledge that we frequently do not give words that are used in regard to male on male experience the same kind of value that we give them in translation or understanding when it is a feminine character who is the object here. So I'd like to make a challenging argument here, which is that this forcible entry, this penetration of Saul's body, in which the outcome is his uncontrollable speaking in ecstasy, acting in another way, becoming another man, is an example of a kind of violence that is done to him that, of course, he has no chance to consent or agree with. And this kind of forcible entry, this forcible use of Saul's body occurs again when the deity does the same thing and turns him into a kind of berserker to be able to deal with Nahash in a later chapter and to fight against him. The first thing that Saul does in this berserker state is to cut up an animal and send all of its parts to all Israel. So you can see that the scenery, the manifestations here are kind of a hyper-masculine display or a complete loss of control of the body, both of which are not under Saul's decision-making power. These things are happening because Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh has made them happen, not because Saul asked for them to happen or requested them in any prayer or request to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh for aid. None of this generated what his body experiences. A second example I want to give to you is something that again will reflect the way translators deal with Hebrew terminology differently when the subject is gendered female than male. So we see three texts in front of us. One is from Samuel. This is when Samuel quite rightfully expects that the Philistines will do what warriors do in this world, which is to penetrate, to humiliate, to decapitate, to mutilate their enemies as part of the way that they feminize them and humiliate them and debase them and their bodies. Let's remember that Saul ends up being mutilated in just this way and his headless body put on display. So he is fearing actual consequences here. And he tells his arms bearer, draw your sword, you do this so that they cannot, right? And in the end, Saul essentially commits suicide rather than experience what will be understood in this world as a militarized form of rape. And a similar experience is described in Jeremiah 38:19. Now, in both of these cases, the translators say that the men who are speaking are saying, oh, they might make a mockery of me, they might abuse me. But what is fascinating is that when this very set of words appears in Judges 19:25, when the Levites, Pelegesh, is forced out of the house to a mob of men who rape and torment her all night long, they translate the same language, the same Hebrew construct with the word rape. This is the word that we are looking at. It's a hitpa'el form. And the hitahalalati that you see there is exactly what you find in the judge's text, except instead of be, me, that they will effectively deal wantonly, ruthlessly, or sexually assault me, it is they will assault her. That's the only difference in the judge's text of 1925. So I think it is fair to say that the biblical author is acknowledging what Saul also is acknowledging, that the Philistines are effectively capable of committing this kind of sexualized violence, which stands for a kind of rape of his body. So what are some conclusions we should come to or could come to? Sexual violence is in fact part of what we call sacred text, and it is not only women who experience it. Part of being good at being a man, I'm extremely sorry to say, and much of the books of Samuel involves the capacity to commit metaphorical or real sexual violence against others. You might remember that in effect, almost every major character of the books of Samuel actually rapes. David rapes Bathsheba, and Amnon rapes Tamar, and Absalom rapes his father's wives in front of all Israel on the very roof from which David first saw Bathsheba. I would also like to argue sexual violence is part of everyday life in the United States. I don't think I need to give you statistics to prove that. And that here too, it is not only, in quotes, women who experience it. We have a host of other kinds of victims with other kinds of gender identities, and men are among them. And that part of being good at being a man may in fact involve the capacity to commit metaphorical or real sexual violence against others, as we saw in the Abu Ghraib example and the example of the presumed killer of Osama bin Laden, Elliot. What is it do I think that we might want to sit with? What remains unseen can never be healed. What remains unspoken cannot be healed. What remains unacknowledged cannot be healed. It is in listening, understanding, and acknowledging that we can, in fact, effect healing. I'd like to thank you all and acknowledge that this presentation is dedicated to my husband and son, men who heal.
Toda, 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 Rabbah to 1,000. Rabbi Dr. Thiede, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. It's organization, it's easy to follow. Your wisdom and your scholarship abound. Thank you so much. Friends, I want to remind you, we're going to have time for questions and answers. That time is now. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand over using the raise your hand function, and we will get to you accordingly. I have at least one question that I want to ask our scholar this evening. You know, it's so funny how you think that like some of these gender things are perpetuated by women, and yet it's really interesting to see how much they're perpetuated by men, right? Patriarchal systems have really set us up in this way. And I'm thinking just in light terms, you know, of this idea of taller men being attractive, right? You know, and as you use the text to show how taller men are considered more dominant figures, not necessarily because of their physical prowess, but because of the way that people view them. And yet there are plenty of people who would hate on women to say, oh, women are so superficial. They only really like the tall men, right? They won't go for what are called the short kings. Guys are shorter than 5'5", something like that. And it's really interesting to see how the roots of these things are in patriarchy, right? As opposed to, right, someone thinking that a woman is the devil simply because she likes tall men. That's not really a question. It's more of an observation based on
observation. I hear you. And we are all, regardless of our gender identities, we are all born into a pre-existing set of ideologies that tend to be very difficult to peel away. They become normative for us in the earliest stages of our lives. And so being attentive and trying to evaluate in what ways have I adopted ideas as a woman that might be coming to me from a hegemonic masculine space, but which I have adopted wholeheartedly and then helped to normalize and helped to reinscribe and helped to rewrite onto the fabric of the lives of the men that I know, right? Because I can aid and abet in that. Absolutely, I can. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Martin Paley, we have a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. It's been very interesting. Had lots of thoughts coming up. One of them was that in popular culture, if you watch TV or movies, if a man is trying to shame another man, he calls him a bitch. And I thought that was interesting. Or you're subservient to me, you are my bitch, meaning that you're subservient to me. And I thought it came up as you were talking about this. It just seems as though that's a popular culture slogan. And I just really wanted to mention that. And to emasculate a man is to call him a woman.
Indeed. And I mean, describing a man's size. I remember Donald Trump calling Mike Bloomberg Mini Mike. Do you remember that? And Ted Cruz was baby, right? These are all ways in which men prove that dominance. And by labeling a man a woman and by feminizing a man, this becomes like one of the most insulting things you can do in this very hypermasculine binary sort of world. We are absolutely living in an age in which that kind of thing is normative and not infrequent. I also would be happy to welcome both comments and questions, right? You can also feel free to just tell me what your reaction was to this. I imagine that for some of you, this might have been difficult or challenging or unsettling. Jay?
I have a general comment on kind of, you know, what I've been thinking about the last few weeks and how this kind of relates to that. I mean, we're, you know, just overall in like human development, right? Where we started out fight or flight, right? And we still have some of that in us, but as we transition to more of a intellectual being, right? We don't really need that anymore. So we're kind of in the middle right now, where still some of this fight or flight stuff pertains, right? But it's less and less accepted, you know, back in biblical days, that's what you did, right? You had to survive, and now you don't really need that. You need a good working brain to get you through the complex world. So I just thought it's, interesting to think of it in that context.
So Jay, I'd probably dispute a little bit my students often also do this, right? That's the way it was back then, right? Is a kind of a default position that we frequently go to. But I would say that every element that I have described is absolutely part and parcel of our own culture that we continue to see, as I noted with this example of the Osama bin Laden killer, right? We continue to see that kind of language used. And as Martin also mentioned, right, the calling of a man a bitch. It is certainly true that most of us are not having to earn our living through physical labor of the kind that might have been the typical form of sustaining life in the ancient world. But it is not clear to me that the ideological framework, the hegemonic masculinity of the Tanakh is much different from the hegemonic masculinity I see functioning all around me in social media, in interactions, in, the fact that it's certain kinds of human beings, transgender women, for example, who are so often the primary victims of sexualized violence of that constituency needs to be thought about, right? We need to think about these structures of domination and subordination that function even in our own time and are governed by our own hegemonic masculinity and its premises. So I also noted that there was
there are questions in the chat box, but I want to follow up just Rabbi, if I could,
sure.
Barbara. Jay brings up a good point that, we're speaking about different contexts between the biblical age and the modern age, but these forms of expressive dominance still do occur in physical forms all the time, right? And certainly in visual displays. I mean, you could take a look at the political climate this past season, right? Before Election Day, at both the RNC and the DNC, the conventions, by that I mean, the RNC had Hulk Hogan show up and rip his shirt off, right? As a way of demonstrating like these are the types of men we're trying to attract. And everything that Hulk Hogan represents in that. Barack Obama made a joke about Trump's obsession with size, right? Also kind of insulting Trump's size as well. There's talk about Tim Walz, and does Tim Walz get a pass to cry because he has jock insurance, meaning he's so far on the jocularity scale because he's a coach and a football coach and all that stuff that he's allowed to cry, right? And so does he appeal with another generation, another group of guys? And it's also clear that men overwhelmingly voted for Trump in this election. And that Trump recently made an appearance over at the MMA fight this past weekend. Actually, he showed up in person and hugged Joe Rogan. So the role of masculinity and patriarchal dominance and dominance in general is still very much tangible and alive today, and projected all over the place, particularly in the political arena. But let's also get to those questions in the chat box as well.
Sure.
Barbara, do you want to pick which one you answer first?
I'll start with the one that first came in from Eric. And I always tell my students, I will never speak of that in which I do not have any real expertise. So I'm not going to speak about Muslim scripture because I don't read it in its original language and it's not my focal point of study. Is it true that we have seen atrocities committed that look a great deal like the kind that I've described here? And I think against all kinds of, again, genders, we did absolutely see that as one of the outcomes of October 7. This is, in fact, a reality in our time, in prison life, in wartime, in all sorts of violent settings. So much so that I'm not sure we can claim to have made any progress in our capacity to humiliate, debase, and sexually assault other human beings as human beings. I don't see that we've gotten any better at reducing the amount of sexualized violence we are capable of. So that would be my answer to this question. And the episode in which Noah is drunk and exposes himself and the reaction of his sons, oh my goodness, this has gotten a great deal of attention by scholars recently, some of whom regard the languaging that goes on there as one that suggests a potential sexual assault on Noah. This is, I would say, one of the most current texts that people have looked at in terms of an example of a potential rape of a male figure. Other ones, including, by the way, Sisera, where there, in this case, we have a female actor, Yael, but also a female actor who is described in male ways and whose very name, Yael, is a third person masculine verb for to go up. So we have multiple moments in Tanakh which suggest that sexualized violence is happening even in an interfamilial way, in an intergendered way, as well as a male on male kind of construct. This is one of the cases that scholars have recently taken up. Absolutely.
I was kind of curious to know your thoughts on the circumstance and the rape of Dinah and the response by the brothers, you know, and what that ended up demonstrates. I mean, please.
Yes, I don't believe the brothers are actually as interested in Dinah as they are in what they achieve by the wholesale slaughter of an entire town. We frequently forget that they take out all the women and children, all the people that do not survive their own killing spree are their booty. So if we're talking about taking captive, and what happens to captives in Tanakh is not pretty, and it involves rape on a regular kind of basis, from Deuteronomist texts around the so-called captured bride, that is an ethnic other female who has managed to survive a war, and she is literally completely at the subject of the Israeli soldier who takes her and uses her for his sexual purposes. But in Dinah's case, I've often felt that story is one that really reaches often into the lives of women I myself have taught, who have known what it is to have the men around them respond to the violence they experience in ways that have nothing to do with their care, their well-being, and their trauma, right? And instead, it becomes a masculine a venue for male competition, for war, for dominance, and all the rest. So I think Dinah is a very painful and very real story for our time as well.
Just so in case people don't know, I realize we kind of gave a little bit of a summary without giving the full description of a very important story in the Torah. We all know that Jacob had 12 sons, but he also had a daughter, Dinah, who often doesn't get mentioned with the exception to this story. And it happens that in this story, she meets a wealthy young man who's the son of a wealthier, man in town. And he rapes her. And the story gets back to Jacob, and the brothers say to the wealthy man and his son, you guys have to circumcise yourselves if you're going to do this, because now you've joined with our family. And the process of them being circumcised and in their pain, a couple of brothers sneak in and slaughter the entire town, all the men in the town.
Right.
And yes, take the women as booty, as prizes. So it's another interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of many texts that feminist scholars in particular have lifted out of its, relative, out of the quiet,
Right.
hidden places where it has rested in the Genesis stories. We get like 3 lines that have to do with Dinah, and this all happens because she goes out to make friends with girls of the land.
Right.
A piece, by the for which she is blamed by various kinds of Christian and rabbinic texts. She shouldn't have left home. She
Right.
shouldn't have
She was
gone
asking
out.
for it.
She's
Right.
asking.
Well, and your point also in terms of how they're more concerned about the disgrace they feel at what's happened, right? And the vengeance they take on the men as a result, right? And how they don't really care about Dinah. Her silence is just glaringly obvious, right? The fact that she's just an object in her own story. She doesn't really have any speaking lines, I think. And particularly in the response that her father and the brothers give, they don't ask her any questions. They don't wait for her response. They act entirely. And so you have to wonder, who are they really in it for? Yeah. And you make a great argument. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. Do you have time for one more question
Yeah.
or comment? No?
I have one more question, but I can't find the raise your hand. I apologize.
That's quite all right, Mark.
I appreciate that. This is all really fascinating, and thinking in the last few weeks, there have been so many examples in the parashot that would really fit into this. And one of the ones I'm wondering about is Lot after they've left Sodom and Gomorrah and his 2 daughters, where they basically rape him.
Yes, that's
And
correct.
how that fits in, is this the emasculation of Lot, or is that sort of how would you paint that or put this into your framework?
Yeah, that is another one of those texts that has recently come in for a great deal of attention. Lot's daughters get him drunk and they rape him. If Lot were female, we wouldn't think twice about regarding a female being made drunk, right, by men and then being used sexually as an act of rape. So indeed, there is, I would regard that as an act of sexual assault. I would also say, yes, indeed, this is a feminization of Lot, because in Tanakh, men are supposed to be the penetrators, not used, penetrated, or become objects for others' sexual aggressions. And that indeed this text is about as painful as the Noah text is, in a very similar kind of way, where you are looking at the potential of how a man is effectively debased, humiliated, and feminized, and in this case by women. In that sense, Mark, I would say the comparison for me is actually in potentially the Yael text, where Sisera is also lying down and is being, is acting like a child and being treated like a child and being brought milk and being covered up, right, and put in this sort of helpless state before she then takes a tent peg and drives it, some scholars read the Hebrew here as through his mouth, so that it's an oral penetration that he experiences. So I would say those two can be put in conversation with each other about where the female actors are considered.
And Barbara, I do want to also leave you with one more question, and standing on 1 foot question. Since the title of the conversation tonight was being good at being a man, what men can learn or unlearn from Tanakh, right? What do you think the on 1 foot lesson is for our men in attendance tonight with regard to the stories that you've shared in your scholarship? What's your on 1 foot answer?
On 1 foot. If you cannot name it, you cannot change it. That's it. Go look,
Okay.
name it, and then change it.
Barbara, thank you so much for all your scholarship and your time and your wisdom, which you've given so generously in educating us on how to be better men.
Blessings to
Toda
you.
Rabah and Lila Tov. Have a wonderful evening to everyone. We'll see you again. Take care.
Take care.